technical problem solved. Thank you so much for, first of all, to the CETRA board for the invitation. It must be coming up on a year now since the invitation was given to me. So I've had a lot of sleepless nights, but in a very, very good sense. It's really exciting to be here. I'm just looking at all the faces and I'm looking forward to the conversations. And I just really want to say thank you. It's an honor. And looking back over the list of the previous CETRA chair professors, also really big shoes to fill. That's an impressive list. So congratulations to you, because you've brought all of those people together. And I mean, this is a wonderful tradition, and I'm so honored and happy to be part of it. So thank you very much to the board, to Jack, who did a lot of the work coordinating with me behind the scenes, to Stephen as well, who did a lot of work, but also to everyone who's here and part of this. And I'm really thrilled that we are able to do it in person. That's just a nice extra touch. Okay, so when I was trying to choose a theme to sort of coordinate or give some coherence to the 2 weeks that we're going to have together, technology was an obvious one, because I've been working almost my whole career in translation technology. But I also recognize that not everybody is working in technology. And so I also wanted to kind of put an angle on the theme that would broaden it a little bit and maybe allow other people to make connections to their own research. So I'm hoping that, you know, between them, whether it's through technology or whether it's through the kind of broader lens of privilege and marginalization, that you will find some ways to make some of the things I have to share relevant to your work, but also to bring your own work into the discussions with me and with other people here. I hope that you'll be able to see something of a connection to the work that you're doing. So let's get going. Translation technology is something that everyone has a lot of feelings about right now, especially, but always, I would say. Technology has always elicited very strong feelings. It's often quite a polarizing thing. Sometimes people really love it, sometimes people dislike it, sometimes people love to hate it, but we all have a feeling, some kind of thing about translation technology. So even if it's not your main area of research, I'm sure it's something that you've thought about. It's been, I would say, almost impossible not to think about it for the past 4 or 5 years. I would give a shout out to one of the previous CETRA professors, Kaisa Koskinen, and her co-author Minna Ruokinen, who wrote a really lovely paper. If you're interested in hearing about how translators feel about technology, you might like to check that one out. They had such a creative method for investigating it by asking translators to write either love letters or hate mail to translation technology. So very fun paper if you're interested in reading more about it. And technology, of course, is not something that's specific to translation. We have translation technology, but technology more broadly is on the minds of a lot of people these days, especially as AI begins to infiltrate more and more parts of our lives, more and more aspects of our lives. And one very commonly held view about technology is that it is somehow neutral. We call this technological instrumentalism. And here's a quote from Noam Chomsky, who was asked his views on technology, not about translation technology, but about technology in relation to education. And even though this is a quote from Chomsky, it reflects the views of many people. He said, as far as technology itself and education is concerned, technology is basically neutral. It's like a hammer. The hammer doesn't care whether you use it to build a house or whether on torture, using it to crush somebody's skull. The hammer can do either. So this instrumentalism view is kind of really focused on the idea that it's not the technology in and of itself that's good or bad, but it's what we do with it, how we use it, how we apply it, whether we apply it for something positive or something negative. So this is quite a common view, but I think more and more, and especially now in the age of AI, we're starting to realize that it is not necessarily true. And there was a famous historian of technology who put together a series of what he called laws about technology, and they're probably more accurately described as truisms. But Melvin Kranzberg, in his first law of technology, said, well, technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. So this is a theme that we're going to explore a little bit about why technology is not neutral. And we're going to look at technology over the next couple of weeks through the lens, as I said, of privilege and marginalization, and how it contributes to or is affected by those two concepts. So if we just look up in a very basic dictionary the definition of privilege, we're talking about some kind of advantage that usually a small group of people, here the example is wealth or high social class, but really it can be just a sort of a group that's elite for some reason, and they have privilege as compared to other people. So if we're thinking about technology, it could be the developers or the users of technology, and how some groups have more benefits from that technology than others. So it's a little bit about a power thing. And marginalization, the same thing. It's the flip side of privilege. We're talking about a group who is somehow relegated to a position of lesser importance, lesser influence, a little bit on the periphery rather than being at the center. So again, we see it's related to this idea of power. And this is not strange, I don't think, in translation circles. Even if we're not talking about technology, we know that translation itself can be, influenced. That we have, for example, certain languages that are more at the center and other languages that seem to be more at the periphery. Or, as in this example here, certain language varieties that seem to take a more central position and others more on the outskirts. So here we see that this dictionary, at first we might be thrilled that there's a recognition that there's more than one variety of English. We have an example of the definition in British English and one in American English. And of course it is a good thing that there's more than one variety recognized in the dictionary, but what's less good is all the varieties that are not recognized in the dictionary. So even a tool like a dictionary can be exerting influence of privilege and marginalization. So I'm quite sad to see that Canadian English is not there. Maybe others are more disappointed to see that other varieties are not there. Even though we have more than one variety, there's still very much the dominant varieties that are recognized, and the others are just absent. Okay, so let's get to talking about translation technology. 2024 is actually the 75th anniversary of Weaver's memorandum. So this is actually another, with the 35th anniversary for CETRA, but the 75th anniversary for Weaver's memorandum. And if you don't know already, Warren Weaver was trained as a mathematician. So he's not a linguist, but he's very much credited as kind of getting the ball rolling on translation technology. In the 1940s, he was working for the Rockefeller Foundation, and he had really one of the most awesome jobs that you can imagine. His job was to discover what was going to be the next big thing and to throw money at it. It was a great job. So he was kind of looking, what's on the horizon, what's new, what's happening, and what should the Rockefeller Foundation be funding in terms of research. And this was 1949. So very recently, the Second World War had just ended. And also politically, the United States was moving into the Cold War era. So that was the kind of political happenings in the time when he was doing his reflecting on what would be the next big thing and what should we do, what should we fund with the Rockefeller Foundation money. And he framed his initial explorations into machine translation. So he wasn't a linguist, but he was interested in the next big thing. And of course, computers were the next big thing in the 1940s, right? Computers were very, very new invention at that time. And he wrote a memorandum. It was not very long. It was 10 pages, double-spaced. So it was quite a modest document, probably because he didn't know a lot about translation or about machine translation. He was just kind of bouncing some ideas around, and so this document was only about 10 double-spaced pages, but it has really been pivotal in launching machine translation research. And he said in this document, a most serious problem for UNESCO, which was also a recently established at that time, for UNESCO and for the constructive and peaceful future of the planet, because everyone was thinking about peace in this post-war period, is the problem of translation, as it unavoidably affects the communication between peoples. So Weaver was reflecting on translation and how, in the absence of translation, it would be more or less difficult to achieve world peace. So he had this big idea. This is a little bit what Mona Baker has referred to as a master narrative for translation. She said, when we think about translation, the master narrative is that it's a force for good, right? We're thinking about translation as building bridges, connecting cultures, bringing people together, achieving world peace, for example, through translation. But unfortunately, this was on page 4 of his memorandum, and if we go even just to the bottom of page 4, we see that it's not so much about world peace anymore. He continues, and he's talking about himself now as not being an expert in translation or computer science, but having inferred considerable about powerful new mechanized methods in cryptography, one naturally wonders if the problem of translation could conceivably be treated as a problem in cryptography. When I look at an article in Russian, I say, this is really written in English, but it has been coded in some strange symbols. I will now proceed to decode. So you can see already the influence of that wartime situation on Weaver's thinking. Cryptography was used in the Second World War to, the Enigma machine and all of that, to decrypt messages from the German forces, and it was one of the most pivotal things, I think, that helped turn the war in the favor of the Allies. And so we see the influence there, thinking about cryptography, but we also see, was it just random that he chose Russian as the language? For example, he could have picked any language, but he picked Russian. And we have to think that this was also with a view to what this technology could be used for in the future. We were heading into the Cold War, so cracked the problem of German cryptography already, but how can we turn this technology now towards our new situation and to our advantage? So really, his reality, he was not neutral. He was not thinking about technology in a neutral way. He had his own agenda, as everyone does. And so this was the beginning of machine translation. He started off talking about world peace, but very quickly segued into a discussion of how can we use this technology to our advantage in the Cold War. And we can see that it wasn't just Warren Weaver. This idea caught on, and the very first operational system of machine translation. It had a lot of flaws, but the first system was demonstrated at what is now called the Georgetown IBM experiment in the early 1950s. So this was the first working operational machine translation system, and it did indeed translate only from Russian into English. So we sort of think, who was that intended to benefit? Was this really with world peace in mind, or was this with a different motive. And the Rockefeller Foundation was interested in providing seed funding for things. So this was essentially a pilot project with the idea that, now that they had a working demonstration system, they could attract funding from other places. They could, kind of scale things up. And it did, in fact, attract funding. It attracted funding from the CIA and from DARPA, which is the research arm of the Department of Defense in the United States. So very much the early history of machine translation is rooted in these kind of military, this military agenda, I guess, is behind it, and not really the world peace agenda that we might have preferred to see. Okay. So we don't have time to cover the whole history of machine translation, but I would like to talk about a few other points, a few other pivotal points in the history of machine translation. So the beginnings of it we see were not as neutral as we would have perhaps hoped or expected, but definitely had a very specific agenda. So in the 1950s and into the mid-1960s, the most active countries involved in machine translation research were the United States and the Soviet Union at the time. And they, as we can see, had sort of very pragmatic but political or military motivations for their work. But Weaver's memorandum did launch a broader wave of interest in machine translation. It sort of, made people think about what these new computers, this new technology, what it could be used for. And so there were some other groups that were established for machine translation research. There was notably work in Japan, there was work happening in France. But in those countries, the motivation was really that machine translation was a very interesting research problem. Computers were new, and this idea was kind of fascinating. And we saw some very, very creative approaches to machine translation that came out of France and Japan in that early period, none of which resulted in a working system. They were focusing on this idea of an intralingua, a sort of language that was completely neutral, that was not any particular language. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to a successful system, but there was that whole kind of just idea that this is a really interesting problem. But in terms of the practical working systems that were developed, they were more with that military agenda in mind. And of course, you've probably heard of the Alpac report, even if you don't know all the details. This was another, Weaver's memorandum was the document that launched it all, and the Alpac report was the document that almost killed it all. It was a very negative, damning report about the progress of machine translation. So I'm going to come back to that in a second, but it sort of formed a dividing line between that early era where everything was exciting and possible, and a period where the funding was withdrawn. So what we see in the decade after the Alpac report, it's often called the quiet decade in terms of machine translation research, because there was not a lot of activity. It was very difficult to obtain funding, and the only groups that seemed to keep working on it, although at a sort of more modest pace, were groups in Canada and in the EU, because in Canada, the Official Languages Act had come into force in 1966, and in the early days of the European Union as well, of course, they were dealing with a pragmatic need for official language translation, languages that were required by some level of legislation to be available, to have documentation available in all official languages. So for those few groups that kept working on machine translation, their reasoning had shifted to a very pragmatic one. But then things started to pick up again in the 1980s, but for very different reasons. At this point, we had seen a lot of very impressive and important technological developments that were not specific to translation, but were setting the scene for what we could do with technology and translation in the future. So we saw hardware advances. This is when computers became much more powerful, faster, smaller, more storage. So the technology had advanced quite a lot from that state it was in the 1950s. We saw that word processing was becoming firmly established in the 1980s. People were producing documents in electronic form. And of course, we saw that the internet, and in particular the World Wide Web, became more accessible to everyday people. And so that technological landscape opened the door for another wave of interest in translation technology. But now the motivation was much more commercial. How can we profit from this? How can we see translation more as a business? And so we saw a resurgence of interest in the US, all across Europe, in Asia, so it was becoming a much more global phenomenon. Okay, so that's like a very brief picture of some of the main periods of machine translation history, but let's dig a little more deeply into, first of all, the Alpac document. The initial experiment by Weaver, that seed funding that came from the Rockefeller Foundation, and then more money was poured into it, particularly from a defense aspect, but from other companies as well. After 15 years of throwing money at this situation, these groups said, you know, like, we'd like to see a little evaluation of what we're getting for our money. So they put together a group which was called the Automatic Language Processing Advisory Committee. And essentially this group, which were the heads mainly of large businesses that had funded machine translation research, and a couple of researchers. So a couple of university representatives, but mostly representatives from funding agencies in the United States, did an investigation, and it took them about 2 years, and at the end of it, they published this report, which is now called the Alpac report. And it was extremely damning of the situation. They said, you know, machine translation is just not cutting it. We do not have useful machine translation. Further, there is no immediate or predictable prospect of useful machine translation. But we have to sort of take a step back and think, useful for what? Useful to whom? There were no people on this committee from, I don't know, hospitals or school education. You know, they were basically saying this is not useful for military purposes. It's not accurate enough for military. We need really accurate information for the military purposes. And so, therefore, it's not useful. World peace is not on the table anymore. This is like not at all what they're considering, but no, it's not useful. And they, you know, graciously acknowledged while translation itself is vital, needs for translation are being met by a small, though capable activity. So they meant by this that there were enough professional translators around to do the job, to meet the needs of translation. But again, whose needs? You know, we know that even today, there are many more translators now than there were in the 1960s, but we know there are massively unmet needs for translation. So again, we think about whose needs, you know, where are these translators working? And the decision-making power who decided to pull the funding from machine translation was really not considering the bigger picture. They were really considering, you know, narrow set of needs. And, you know, one of their final statements was, how much money should be spent on research and development toward improving translation? It would be unreasonable to spend extravagantly on a relatively small business that is doing the job satisfactorily. So that, as I said, cut the knees off, like cut off translation research at the knees in the 1960s. And we think now, you know, maybe we could have been further along, maybe we would have solved more problems if it hadn't been such a devastating report, but that's where we are. And so we entered into that quiet decade where not much happened. And it was not so long after the Alpac report that we saw James Holmes come out with his map of translation studies. And it's quite interesting, when you look at the map, to see that technology is not specifically mentioned there. You might think that there would be a place for it in the section called translation aids, but when you dig into it, you see that when Holmes referred to translation aids, he was really specifically talking about two different types of aids: grammars and dictionaries and term bank resources. So technology was not on the map of translation studies in 1972. That's not that long ago. That's like just over 50 years ago. Technology was not there in translation studies. But we see that the landscape is changing, and in particular in the 1980s, we have some major technological advancements. But I'd like you to sort of look at where the advancements are coming from and who's behind them, and therefore who might be benefiting from them. Because when we say that technology is not neutral, part of what we mean is that technology is created by people, and people bring with them their own perspectives, right? They have opinions, they've been educated in a certain way, they come from a particular culture, they were raised with certain values. People are not neutral, and so the things that they create are not neutral either. And so it could be unconscious. It doesn't mean that people are malicious. It just means that we all bring a certain perspective to the things that we do, the things that we create. And so when we look at these technological advancements that happened in the 1980s, one of the big ones was microprocessors. In the 1950s, a computer would fill this room. They were huge. They used vacuum tubes that were kind of always, exploding and needing to be replaced. Microprocessors are the reason that we have desktop computers, that we have smartphones, that we have phones that we can wear on our wrist. This technology really, was a huge step forward. And the first microprocessor was introduced by Intel. They still have the lion's share of the market. They're a very big US-based company. We also saw in this period the introduction of what we might describe as high-level programming languages. You all know that computers speak in binary, right? They use binary code. And some of the early programming languages really were not much more than numbers and binary code. And at a certain point, they said, we got to make programming more user-friendly. We need to have, we have humans who are interacting with computers, and can we come up with a language, a programming language that's not just numbers, that seems a little more like language, the way that people actually communicate. And so we saw some of the early programming languages like Fortran, COBOL, C, and what we started to see was that, yes, they did look more like human language, but like one particular human language, right? They looked like English. And so if you have any programming experience at all, you know that some of the commands that you need to use as part of the computer language are actually based on English. And we saw word processors come out. This was huge for the situation that we're in now, this data-driven situation. In order for us to be in a data-driven world, we need data, and the data for translation is language, text that's in machine-readable form. So word processors were really instrumental in bringing us to this data-driven situation. And again, how many of you use a word processor made by one of those companies? Microsoft, Apple, Google. Is anyone using anything else? No. Okay, so we see the influence again of a few large companies that come from one particular culture. And now we have localization, which I'll get to in a minute talking about, but in the beginning, all of the interfaces for these word processors were all in English. So in the beginning, if you wanted to use a word processor, you had to use an English interface on your word processor. A huge development in the 1980s, of course, was the World Wide Web. The internet had started a bit earlier in the 60s, again, for defense reasons. That was the origins of the internet, were rooted in defense. But by the 80s, it was more available on everyone's desktop, or you could access it from yourself. You didn't have to be in one of the defense circles. And we saw Tim Berners-Lee, who's a graduate of Oxford, so from the UK. He was the one who actually developed some of those early protocols for the World Wide Web as we know it today. And he was extremely generous in the sense that he said, I am not going to sell the source code for the web. I'm going to give it away for free because I think it should be free to everyone. I want to make it an open and democratic platform. So extremely good intentions, but when you look at that history, the browsers that you had to use to access the internet in the beginning were only in English. The source code for HTML and other markup languages based on English. In the beginning, there was ASCII, which you might know is a way of encoding characters. When ASCII was first developed, it worked only on the Latin alphabet. Then they extended it so that it included Latin alphabet with diacritics. It wasn't until Unicode came out that we could encode languages that are not based on the Latin alphabet, which are most languages. And the Unicode is still being developed. So the most recent release for Unicode was in 2022, version 15, but they're still adding new scripts. So even today, all of the world's languages are not able to be encoded in, so which means we can't see them in an interface, we don't have them on a keyboard, and so this is still something that is ongoing. So all of these things, yes, it was great to release the code for the web and to sort of say, well, now it's open and it's democratic. But we even have to think about that time in the 1980s and to a certain extent today. In order to access this open and democratic platform, first you need a computer. Then you need power to kind of make the computer. You need an internet connection. So it's democratic and open to a certain extent. There are still many parts of the world that don't have access to the internet. And this is not to knock Tim Berners-Lee. I think it was hugely generous, but just deciding that it will be open doesn't make it accessible to everyone. Okay. Then, following that, when the web was hugely instrumental in making it possible to have a global marketplace, to start selling things internationally. And this is when we saw localization emerge in translation. Localization began with basically adapting software packages into other languages so that they would have different interfaces in different languages, and people could use them, get help messages and the documentation and all of the things that come with a software package in their own language. But we have to recognize that localization is the sort of the flip side of a business strategy, which is called globalization. So the motivations behind localization were definitely business-driven. And in business, some markets are more profitable than others. So very early on in the world of localization, the term FIGS localization emerged. And FIGS stands for French, Italian, German, and Spanish. And these were, in the beginning, in the 1990s, the most profitable languages for localization because they had the biggest market, people willing to pay money for software products adapted into the FIGS languages. I looked up the data to see what are the most common localization languages today. We're like 45 years later, and it's still FIGS. There are some other languages, we're getting close to some of the other languages competing, but it's still those 4 languages that have the largest share of the market today. So interesting, I think, that it hasn't evolved that much. There are, nearly 7,000 languages in the world, and we're still focusing on FIGs. And of course, English is almost always the source language, almost always. Yeah. When we see localization into other languages, it has often started out, at least, if it has become commercial now, it may well have started out as a community-driven effort. Open source software was the first type of software that was localized into many different languages. The open community, which means also volunteer translation, crowdsourcing. So languages that are not deemed profitable, the communities might find value in having the resources in those languages, but they're doing it themselves and for themselves, rather than having it commercially produced. And so in this period, what we see is that the internet essentially brought, or the web brought, new markets, which meant more volume. Now there's a bigger demand for translation. We're not in those Alpac days anymore, where we could look around and say, oh, there's enough professional translators to meet the needs of the market. All of a sudden, the market has gotten a lot bigger, and the number of translators has not kept pace with, so supply and demand issue. And so we've entered that period where productivity is like the word that translators hear all the time now, right? We have to be more productive. We've got to up our volume. We have to translate more words, increase our quotas. And so the only way for a person to do that, because there are only so many hours in the day, is either work more or get some kind of help. And the help that a lot of people turned to was technology. Makes sense. And so we saw new tools start to enter the market. This was in the 1990s and early 2000s when we saw really translation memories take a sort of a firm hold in the market. And translation memories are a type of data-driven terminology. And we also saw in this period a very significant paradigm shift in the approach to machine translation. The early days of machine translation, the developers had tried to imitate a little bit the way that people process language. So they had coded grammar rules into the computer program, and they had built large bilingual dictionaries. And so this type of rule-based translation was very linguistically oriented. As we approached the new millennium, we all of a sudden found ourselves in this very different technological landscape where people were using word processors. Data was being produced in electronic form. We could access and share data easily over the internet. Computers were faster, smaller, more powerful, had a lot of storage space. So the possibilities changed for how we could approach translation. And so this is where the idea of data-driven translation started to emerge. It first came out as statistical machine translation. That was the first, when Google Translate was first released in 2006, it was a statistical machine translation system. But statistical is still data-driven, right? So it's based on a large training corpus. And then now, of course, we've moved into the neural machine translation and large language models, which are even still corpus-based, still data-driven, but the corpora are even bigger now. But we saw this trend starting around the turn of the new millennium. And this is the situation that we're in now, basically. We're in this data-driven world. And now, if we look at Van de Pitte's remapping of translation studies, which happened sort of in that early 2000s period, as we had started moving into this data-driven world, now we see that, in contrast to the situation when Holmes had drawn his map, we see that translation technology does figure now quite visibly and quite strongly in the world of translation studies. So we see it in studies about translation and technology. We have machine translation, also machine-aided translation. We see people evaluating the quality of machine translation or machine-aided translation. We've got localization, which I mentioned. How does technology affect the process, the product? Website translation, that's a type of localization, I would say. And we also see that technology figures quite strongly in the curriculum of training new translators. We have to make them aware of technology. So now in that short period from between 1972 and 2008, we went from 0 to quite a prominent figuring of technology in our conception of translation studies. But what are some of the things that we need to think about now? So we've got those sort of categories. One of them is, what are the effects of translation technology on the process, on the product, on the people? One of the things that is in principle good about data-driven approaches to technology is that we don't have this need, as we did in the days of rule-based translation, to develop a system for every language combination, right? Programming those grammatical rules, building those large bilingual dictionaries, that was really painstaking work. That took a huge effort, and it had to be done individually, not only for each language, but for each language pair and each language direction. So a tool that was developed, just like if you have a dictionary from English to Russian in the early days, didn't go from Russian to English as well. You had to program both sides of it. So it was a hugely labor-intensive, time-consuming effort to make machine translation software. In the data-driven world, in principle, the system can handle any language. You just have to provide the data. So in principle, it should be an equalizer. It should be a good thing. The challenge in practice is that the amount of data needed is now like unthinkably large. We've gone from, large corpora being 1 million words. That was really a big corpus in the 1960s, 70s. If you could put 1 million words together, that was impressive. Through statistical machine translation, which probably needed, several million words, into neural machine translation, which needed, 100 million words. Now we're in the age of large language models. We're needing billions and billions of words. And it's easier to put those large collections together for some languages than it is for others. So if you think about languages that are widely spoken, English is an example, French is another example, Spanish is another example. These are languages that have a large number of speakers, so we can get corpora in those languages. But as you know, with translation, we need to have not just a source language, but a target language. So we need some kind of translation activity. So we can only, because we need a bilingual parallel corpus, we can only build large corpora for languages between which there's a lot of translation activity. So again, there's a lot of activity between French and English, but maybe not so much activity between either a language that in and of itself is not widely spoken, like maybe Greek or Danish, and then between those two languages, how much activity is there taking place? So, and again, we can apply this to language varieties. Much easier to build a corpus of American English or UK English with a smaller number of Canadian English speakers, a smaller number of Irish English speakers. And this happens in other languages as well. There's almost all languages have more than one variety. And, when we are talking about translation, often in our world of translation, our translations can be quite specialized. We have legal translation, medical translation. So when we're getting all of these different parameters, we need languages that are widely used, that there's a lot of translation activity, but as we get to more and more specialized domains, we probably have fewer pools of data to draw on. And so for some of these language combinations and varieties, there is nowhere close to billions of words to make a large language model. So we are in a situation where these tools perform very differently for different languages. You can't look at a tool and say like, oh, it's good or it's bad. You say, well, it's not, it's pretty good for English to French translation, but it's less good for another language combination. And so we're seeing, again, this exacerbation. While the technology in principle could be used to create translation models for any language, the data is only available for some languages or more easily accessible for some languages. So it's not a problem of the technology per se, but the technology is exacerbating the problem, I would say. So some of the effects of data-driven approaches are that there are still certain languages, and therefore the people who use those languages, that are gaining from this technology, and other people who are unable to leverage the technology to the same extent. And what seems to be happening is that it's the languages where people are already in privileged positions that are getting more tools or better tools. So it's the English speakers, for example, who are getting, the newer, bigger, better versions of the tools, and speakers of other languages are not. So I would say the digital divide is being exacerbated a little bit. We've also seen that now data is a commodity. Data is valuable. It is what makes these tools work. If you don't have the data, it doesn't matter how good your algorithm is. It can be the best algorithm in the world. If it has no data, it doesn't work. So data is a commodity now. It's very valuable. And this is leading to some questionable practices. So we're going to talk a lot more about that tomorrow, because we're going to focus on ethics tomorrow. And we'll see just how cringy some of these practices are. We're also wondering, it's still early days, so we don't necessarily have a lot of longitudinal data, but there's already concern. Essentially, these tools work on principles of recycling, right? They are reusing examples of things that they've already seen. And so at what point does the recycling kind of lead to maybe a flattening of language? And so I'd say we don't know the long-term effects, but I would say even some of the early evidence is that there will be an effect. It will have an effect on our language. We've also started to see that machine translation is being used widely, tremendously. People outside of the translation professions are really using this technology a lot. And there was a paper recently published that said a shocking amount of the web is now machine translated. So we are getting into a situation where machine translation is being used to translate texts which are published on the web, which are then scraped back into these engines and being used to produce more text. So we've got this cycle, which I kind of like to call maybe like the cycle of mediocrity, right? If the machine translation is sort of so-so, it's good enough, but it's not great, and we're using that to feed more text, like where does it end? Where will it take us? At what point are we doing a disservice to language? And this is going to have an outsized effect on low-resource languages, because they're the ones that are being machine translated. Right? They're the ones, and they're the ones for which the quality of machine translation is not great. So there's going to be an outsized effect on less widely used languages, I think. Another strategy that people may not be aware of, but that happens sometimes in the background of Google Translate or Microsoft Translator, if there is insufficient data to translate between two languages that have not a good size corpus. The corpus is small, so again, maybe translating from Greek to Danish, I don't know how much activity there is in that language pair. If there's not enough for the developers to feel confident that they could produce a decent translation, they'll use a strategy which is called pivot translation, and it happens in the background. So you ask for Greek to Danish translation, but what happens is that it goes Greek to English because there's a better corpus for Greek to English, and then from English to Danish. But as a translator, you know that a double translation could have an effect, right? There could be problems that happen in the first leg of the translation that get carried over into the second. And also, you know, you might see, we know that there's often an influence of a source language on a target text, right? We can sometimes see the fingerprints of the source language showing up in a target text. So when you're pushing everything always through English, you get the fingerprint effects of English. So even when you're trying to translate from Greek to Danish, if it's going through English in the pivot, it's going to be the English fingerprints that you see in the text. So it's just starting to feel like the English is everywhere, even in language combinations that you don't think it's going to be in. Mm-hmm. And so this has its own effects because we know that when you translate something, it's not just language that you're translating, that you're transmitting. It's culture, it's worldview, it's a way of organizing thought, it's a way of, you know, presenting information. And this, my little tongue-in-cheek graph there. When I see output from ChatGPT, I just somehow feel that it's American. And I mean, I say that as a North American person. And this is one of the reasons why. It's because it's just so enthusiastic. And it's just so, and it's sort of like, it's not like that it's choosing American words or, you know, sentence structures. It's the whole, it just is. You look at it and you're just like, yeah, that's American. And I think that is happening, right? That the more we're using the large corpora from one language variety, it's starting, you know, it's not just the terminology, right? We think about the terminology, but it's like the whole view, it's the whole attitude. There's so much more is being conveyed. And I think we're just getting a lot more of that. So that's maybe coming through, like in the translations of other languages when it's been kind of pushed through English. And through a dominant variety of English, like American English. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping up now because I know we're all excited to get to the reception. But one of the things that I will say is that improvements can sometimes bring new problems. So some of the, you know, and this happens, this is research, right? You try to solve one problem and you accidentally create another. So now we have some new problems that we have to deal with. The sort of master narrative, again, is this idea that we have now got improved access to machine translation, and we've got better quality machine translation. So that means there's more interest. When machine translation was crummy, people weren't interested in using it. Now that it's decent, there's more interest in using it. And we instinctively, we think, okay, that's good. More people breaking down these language barriers. But the reality is now that sometimes people who don't have a background in translation you know, are getting their information about these tools from the popular media, and the popular media is sometimes hyping them unrealistically, right? We can be critical because we know what's involved in translation. People that don't have a background in translation are less able to be critical about it. And so we're seeing an increase in the use of machine translation, but sometimes for risky situations where it's maybe not the right choice. We're seeing maybe situations where people in authority are making a decision to use machine translation, but people who are in a more vulnerable position are not given the choice. So if you are in a doctor's office and the doctor suggests using machine translation, as a patient, what are you going to do? You feel that you are not in the kind of powerful side of that relationship. We've seen some very disturbing cases coming out around immigration, where the agency, the border agent, uses machine translation, and it's the kind of the person who's a refugee or an immigrant who's in a vulnerable position and who is maybe not able to say no. So we're seeing kind of these power struggles around machine translation that are causing concern. We're seeing that the impact is more severe for low resource languages. We're seeing a big need for what I call machine translation literacy, and we will be talking about that more as the summer school goes on. And we're also seeing issues around regulation in both directions. Sometimes there's no regulation, which can be harmful, and sometimes there's regulation that is inappropriate that can also be harmful. So we're in very early days now of trying to regulate AI, and there's a lot of work to be done. So that'll come up again in a future talk. But basically, we have to think about things like who's benefiting from an uncontrolled rollout of AI? Who benefited from that? Well, it's probably the companies that developed the tool and that are grabbing your data for free and making millions off it. And who suffers from it? Well, we're seeing that the people who suffer can be people who are from low resource languages, people who are in vulnerable situations. And so, again, this privilege and marginalization is coming out more strongly than ever, I would say, in this age of AI. Just to end with two very short use cases, this one comes directly from Canada. In 2016, when the early days of neural machine translation, the National Research Council in Canada developed a machine translation tool for French and English that they wanted to roll out in the Canadian Public Service. So this would be employees of the federal government of Canada, which in a bilingual country, all of the communications that come from the federal government need to be in English and French. So it's an example of official languages translation. And in order to understand kind of what happened around this, you need to understand that in the federal service, as in the population of Canada, it's roughly 80 to 85% Anglophones and 15 to 20% Francophones in Canada. So that means that in the federal service, French is a language of translation because 85% of the documents are produced in English and translated into French. So when we have machine translation as the offer to the Francophone community and, normal, natural, human-produced English as the offer to the Anglophone community, we have a real kind of imbalance, or at least the optics are not good, right? The optics are, if you're a Francophone, you get machine translation as your service offering, and if you're an Anglophone, you don't need it. You'll have regular translation. So there was a huge backlash, and I think, it was rooted around this idea, not of a need for translation in the sense that, we don't understand the text, but the perception of what was being offered was just so unequal that it was, they had to withdraw it. They had to pull back the service because they said it's really having an impact on language rights, my right to have, equal level of services offered in both languages, or in my language. So they actually had to pull it back. And it wasn't even necessarily about, it was indirectly about the quality of machine translation, but it was even more importantly about this optics of creating a two-tier system that was a problem. And I'll end with this idea which is a long-standing kind of paradox situation. We often hear that machine translation could be a solution to help endangered languages, that it could be a way of producing more text for these low-resource languages. But I think that there was a researcher, I think he's Czech, but he works a lot with Irish, which is a low resource language. And he said, the role of machine translation is often, pitched as overcoming the perceived barriers that are posed by linguistic diversity. But in a minority language setting, we often want to recreate and reinforce linguistic diversity. Machine translation is counterproductive here. It brings lots of low-quality content into the language, and it allows original content authored in the minority language to escape out of it with ease via translation to the majority, leading to even more domain loss. So his point is that people absolve themselves of the need to learn the minority language. They just figure, well, we'll just use machine translation and we'll get it that way. But it loses, I think, a lot of its richness, and it's interestingly a solution that is often proposed by people who speak a majority language. So again, if I can use an example from Canada, we have French and English as our official languages, but we also have around 60 Indigenous languages in Canada. And the same group, this National Research Council, which does a lot of work in language technologies, went to one of the Indigenous communities and said, we have a good news for you. We have developed a machine translation system that translates from English to Inuktitut. Aren't you so lucky? This is going to be amazing for you. And the community said, well, thank you. I can't use my phone in Inuktitut because there's no encoding for it. If I had to choose a technology, I would rather be able to use my cell phone and look stuff up on the web rather than have this machine translation tool that I didn't ask for and I don't really need and is not that good. So I think there's this rush sometimes for again, these privileged communities to kind of decide what some of the communities that are less well served by technology, what they need and what they have. So we're going to be talking about this again as well when we talk about research methods, how we might do better community-based research. But some of the questions that I think we need to ask are, to kind of beware of this savior complex, either that technology can save us or that, technology that's firmly rooted in one language, culture, perspective can be appropriate for others. We need to think about who's doing the research and development in language technologies, because often, again, it seems to be coming from one culture and then being imposed on another. Who even wants machine translation? Is this the most important tool that we need for in terms of language technologies? And that we might want to pay more attention to community-led solutions that are rooted more in need and respect for the community and what they actually want, and how we can support what's important to them rather than telling them what we've decided is important to them. Okay, and I'm going to wrap it up there. Just to sum up, we've been talking about privilege and marginalization, so some takeaway points are that technology, including translation technology, is not neutral. It's created by people who bring their own perspectives. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a malicious perspective, not at all. Very good intentions sometimes, but they are bringing their own perspective. We also need to recognize that translation technology is part of a larger system. Reino was talking about eco-translation, and we are part of a larger system, and that's going to come up again tomorrow. But sometimes it's not the technology itself that's the issue, but it might be a policy or a use case that it's been applied to, or a user who doesn't know better. What contexts of use. So technology is never going to be the solution, right? It's part of a solution, but it has to be kind of enveloped by other actors and other factors. And that the decisions that are made about and around technology can have cumulative effects, they can have intersectional effects, and they can have long-lasting effects. We're still living the decision of, Warren Weaver. We're still living some of his decisions. These large language models that are available that work fantastically, well, I shouldn't even say that work better for English. This is partly because Intel developed the microprocessor. It's partly because the early programming languages were based on English. It's partly because the Rockefeller Foundation funded things. It's a knock-on effect. It's a cumulative effect. And I don't know how to break the cycle, but I would say the fact that not everyone here is an English speaker is already a good thing, right? That we're thinking about translation and people are working on language technologies who are not Anglophones, and I think that's good, and I think we need more of that. So I'm so happy to see so many different languages, cultures, nations represented here. Okay. So, there we go. Yeah.
The floor for questions if there are any questions. 10 minutes maybe.
Absolutely, yep. It also might need time to reflect on it. So I will be here the whole 2 weeks. So yeah, no, so I'm not leaving like after week 1, so yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's no question.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
So, I was recently talking to a company that was experimenting with automatic subtitling, people subtitling. And they were saying that they're giving up on it because they realize how bad it is when doing it through Korean and Chinese that was going all the way to English to go to Chinese. And so what they're doing now is what they call translation between minor languages, as if Korean and Chinese were minor language, but that's another issue.
They're not figs, they must be minor. Yeah.
I'm just saying this because I think the terms they use,
Yeah.
it's also illustrative of what you were just exactly saying.
Mm-hmm.
So to what point is this the next step, that this data collection and data production is going to be between these minor languages in order to increase? And the main reason they were saying that it didn't work through English was because the worldview was too different, and so it would produce better results between languages that are more familiar,
Yes, closely
to each
related
other.
languages do get better results from machine translation, for sure. One of the things that needs to happen as well, and I think it is happening, is that we need more content to be produced in languages other than English. Right now, because of this situation with the internet and everything, I mean, it's started, and localization started because all of the things were available in English and needed to be localized into other languages. So I think, Hollywood is another phenomenon, right? That there's a lot of content that's created in the United States. One thing that I think was, a small silver lining of the pandemic was that people, burned through all of the content available in English and started realizing, oh, there is some content out there in other languages, because they just ran out of stuff on Netflix, and so in desperation started to look at things from other languages. And so I think that was good, because I think now people realize, oh yeah, like Money Heist was a huge hit in Canada, for example, which is a Spanish thing, which I don't think many Canadians would have watched Spanish content before. And so I think now, we need more stuff like that. We need things that make people aware that, yeah, you can create something in another language and translate it into English, and that's a good thing. So it will happen between other languages as well. When we start having more content creation, then we have more opportunities for translation. But if we want to use technology, then closely related languages do work better at the moment. Will that always be the case? I don't know. I don't know if they can overcome that, but I mean, it's true at the moment of technologies, yeah.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for this great talk. You are aware of the fact that recently it was in the news that academic publishers are selling our articles, let's
That's
say, our
tomorrow's
discourse.
talk.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I
Yes.
didn't know that.
Yeah. No,
Are
please
selling,
go ahead. Yeah.
well, our articles
Yeah.
to, well, companies using training AI and LLMs and so on.
Yeah.
There is a lot to say about that. There are ethical issues, copyright issues, but that's not what I want to talk about here. Their argument, the publisher's argument, is of course that it will improve academic discourse. Do you agree with that argument, first of all? And secondly, to what extent do you see a role for translation there, or translation coming in there?
Yeah, so the case that I'm aware of was Taylor and Francis, who own Routledge, selling the journal data to Microsoft.
Yeah, that was in the news, but they are not the only ones.
Yeah, they probably are others. So that was the big case. So again, we look at, you know, who's benefiting: Microsoft, American company, and will it make AI better? It will make specialized AI better, right? Because at the moment, these large language models are mostly general language text, or they don't have a sufficient volume of specialized material, because a lot of that is paywalled, and they are scraping data from the free web. I don't know, this is Microsoft. They probably have back doors to get into paywall data, I don't know. But in principle, what they have right now is the kind of freely available stuff, and the domain, a lot of the domain-specific stuff is behind paywalls, so that's what's changed now. They have, but it goes back to that point I made about the commodification of data. Data is valuable now. Data is hugely valuable, but there are very unethical practices around it being used. I mean, yeah, it's staggeringly unethical, I think, because particularly in academia, because it's a world where we don't get paid to produce the data. So we produce it, you know, we have our salary, I guess our salary, but, you know, we don't get paid to write an article. So we're producing the data for free, we're reviewing it for free, we sometimes are paying to publish it, we don't have the copyright over it, and then someone else sells it out from under us. So it's particularly egregious, I think, to academics. Will it make it better? Yes, it will, because now they have specialized data, which is missing from their current data set, which is why current MT does not do a good job of academic texts. Will this affect translation? At the moment, people were saying, like, well, you know, if you're a niche translator, if you specialize, then you're gonna, you know, the AI can't do that. Yeah, 6 months from now, it will be doing that because they've sold the data. So it will affect translators, yeah. All of a sudden, the hyper-specialized stuff is not as much of a preserve as we thought it would be, yeah. That's kind of doom and gloom. I don't like to end on that note, but yeah. Yeah, the systems, I mean, machine learning really does learn. It doesn't learn in the same way as people do, but it does learn in its own way. So if you give it the right kind of data, it will learn how to translate or how to write or how to, you know, answer questions about that type of data. Yeah, so again, you know, the discourse is that it will improve, but who benefits from that improvement?